This house is mine. It has always been mine. Your little design hobby was funded by my salary. Did you really think that entitled you to anything here?
Are you sure about the paperwork on this property?
Talia stood beside Gavin Mercer in the middle of our living room, the folder from my studio still in my hand. She didn't hesitate. "My attorneys have reviewed everything," she said. "There is nothing in your name, nothing. I want you out of this house before I call security." Gavin muttered something about turning my studio into a media room. I looked past both of them at the reading chair I had reupholstered 3 years earlier, still facing the window at the angle I had planned for the morning light. Then I did something Talia didn't expect. I smiled. "Good," I said, "because mine already has." I set the folder down on the entry table, shook Gavin's hand once, and walked out the front door before either of them could speak again. Behind me, I heard Talia ask Gavin a question I wasn't meant to hear. Why did he smile like that? I didn't answer that question for her, and I wasn't going to. I got in my car, pulled out of the driveway I had chosen the paint color for, and drove toward the studio with my hands steady on the wheel and my heart doing something considerably less steady underneath my ribs. I called Lenora Banks from a red light on Peachtree, and she picked up before the second ring, the way she always did when she was expecting a call she hoped wouldn't come. I told her what had happened in 3 sentences. She was quiet for a moment, and it wasn't the quiet of surprise. It was the quiet of someone organizing a plan she had already half built. "I had a feeling we were getting close to this," she said. "How do you want to handle it?" "Carefully," I said, "and completely. Then come in tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. I have something to show you that I pulled last week." I asked her what she meant by pulled. "Loan applications," she said. 3 of them, filed through 2 different lenders in the last several weeks. This house is listed as a supporting asset on every one. I didn't say anything for a moment. The light turned green and I drove through it without fully registering that I had. "Talia doesn't have the authority to use that property as collateral," I finally said. "No," Lenora said, "she doesn't, which means somebody is about to find that out the hard way, and it isn't going to be gentle when they do." I asked her how much time we had before the lenders moved forward. "Not as much as I'd like," she said. "These things have a way of finishing themselves once they start. Get some sleep if you can manage it. 8 o'clock. Bring nothing. I already have everything we need." I sat in the studio parking lot after we hung up, not going in, just sitting with the engine off and the city noise settling around me. 15 years of marriage had just ended in a living room with somebody else's hand at my wife's back, and somehow that wasn't even the part of the night that was going to keep me up. What was going to keep me up was the fact that Talia had just made a legal claim in front of a witness on a property that could not legally belong to her, and she had done it with a confidence that told me she had no idea how wrong she was. I have been an interior designer for 18 years. I understand how spaces hold people, how a room can tell you who believes they own it before anyone says a word. Talia believed she owned that house completely, and that belief was about to run directly into a document she had never fully understood, on a table she had never once asked to see. Lenora's office was on the 4th floor of a building she had occupied since before I was born, in the particular sense that the Ramsey family had been her clients that long, and she had been the one constant across 2 generations of us. She was waiting at 8 o'clock with 3 folders already squared on her desk, and she didn't waste time on comfort before she started laying things out. "This is the trust certification," she said, sliding the first folder toward me, though I had seen its contents 100 times before. "Your grandfather set up the Ramsey family trust decades before you were born, specifically to hold this property and a handful of others outside individual ownership. The trust pays the taxes. The trust pays the insurance. The trust has paid every maintenance invoice on that house for as long as you've lived in it. Neither your name nor Talia's has ever been on the deed." "She knows the trust exists," I said. "She's never asked what it means." "That's the part I want to talk about," Lenora said, and something in her tone made me sit forward. "Do you remember our review 6 months ago?" I did. It had been a routine meeting, the kind Lenora conducted every 2 years as a matter of procedure, and near the end of it she had set her pen down and asked me a question I hadn't expected. "Does Talia understand what her position actually is in relation to this property?" she'd asked. Not the general idea of it, the specifics. I had told her the truth, that Talia knew the house was connected to the family trust in some way, but that we had never sat down and gone through what that meant in practice. If the marriage were ever contested, Lenora had said then, the distinction would matter considerably. I had left that meeting thinking about my wife on the drive home in a way I hadn't in years, not with suspicion, but with the specific attention you give something you've stopped examining. "I remember," I said now. "I told you we'd never really discussed it." "You hadn't," Lenora said. "And that gap is exactly what's about to cause a problem for people other than you." She opened the second folder. "This is your prenuptial agreement, 11 pages. You signed it, she signed it, and I offered in writing to refer her to independent counsel so someone could review it on her behalf alone. She declined that offer and signed everything on a Tuesday morning 15 years ago, 3 weeks before your wedding, the way people sign things they don't believe will ever matter." She turned to a page near the back. "This is the residence clause. Talia's right to occupy that property was always conditional on the marriage remaining intact. She has no right to sell, transfer, mortgage, or use the property as collateral in any financial arrangement. None of that has changed in 15 years. I looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. Talia's handwriting, quick and confident. The same handwriting I'd seen on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the design notes she used to leave for me on the kitchen counter when we were younger, and neither of us had learned yet how far apart we'd eventually grow. "So her attorneys pulled the property record," I said slowly, "saw no individual name on the deed, and assumed that meant the house was marital property." "That's my read on it," Lenora said. "They interpreted the absence of your name as confirmation, instead of as a question. They never went looking for what was actually sitting behind that absence because nobody told them there was anything to look for." "And the loan applications." Lenora slid the third folder across the desk. "Filed through her company's usual lender and one additional bank, all 3 within the last 6 weeks. Each one lists this property as a supporting asset for a venture she's launching. Each one carries her signature on a declaration that the property is marital." She looked at me directly. "This isn't a misunderstanding anymore, Calvin. Somebody signed federal loan paperwork certifying ownership of an asset she does not own. That's not a divorce problem. That's the kind of problem that follows a person into rooms she doesn't want to be in." I thought about Gavin then, about the fact that he held a position at Talia's company that involved evaluating exactly this kind of financial structure for a living. A man whose job was risk, sitting across from a property record that returned no recognizable owner, and choosing to accept his girlfriend's word over his own training. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Time," Lenora said, "and for Talia to keep doing exactly what she's doing. The more publicly she asserts ownership, the stronger our documentation becomes. If we move too early, her attorneys pull back and call all of this preliminary. We wait until she's committed too far to retreat." I asked her what that meant in practice. "It means we watch," she said, "and we get someone reliable watching the parts we can't see ourselves." That was the first time she said Sandra Vance's name to me, though I wouldn't understand for another 2 weeks exactly how much that name was going to matter. For now, Lenora simply told me she wanted to retain an investigator she'd worked with for years, someone thorough and quiet, to establish a documented timeline of anything relevant to the marriage's breakdown. I told her to do it. I told her to move carefully, not quickly, and to be ready to walk into a room the moment I told her the time had come. "I've been ready for 6 months," she said, and closed the folder. I didn't go back to the house that week. I stayed at the studio, sleeping on the small couch in the back office more nights than I'd admit to anyone, working through client drawings during the day so that nothing about my professional life would give Talia or Gavin the impression that anything had shifted. Harrison Cole called on the second afternoon to confirm our next project meeting, unaware that anything had happened at all, and I confirmed it in a voice that gave nothing away. Jordan Ellis came by that same week with revised drawings for a client presentation, and somewhere in the middle of reviewing floor plans, Jordan mentioned, almost in passing, that the office redesign contract Jordan had lost months earlier to one of Gavin's preferred firms was still a sore subject. I said I was sorry to hear it. I didn't say anything else, because I didn't yet know how directly that old decision was about to connect to the one Talia and Gavin were making now. Sandra Vance's first report arrived at the end of the second week, a plain manila envelope Lenora delivered to the studio in person rather than by mail. I opened it standing at my drafting table, and I read it once through without sitting down. The relationship between Talia and Gavin had begun 11 months before the night I found them together in our living room. The report was precise, in a way that private suspicion never is. Hotel bookings under a name I recognized as one of Talia's assistants. Restaurant charges on evenings she'd told me she was working late. A weekend in Savannah the previous spring that she had described to me at the time as an industry conference. I remembered driving her to the airport that weekend myself, carrying her suitcase to the curb, kissing her goodbye without a single reason to doubt anything she'd said. What I felt reading that report wasn't the anger I might have expected. It was quieter than that. The particular stillness of watching something you'd built begin to fail in slow motion, understanding that the failure had been happening for a long time before it became visible. I sat with it for one evening, in the back office, with the city going dark outside the window. Then I put the report in the folder Lenora had set aside for it, and I went back to the drawing I'd been working on before it arrived, because there was nothing else useful to do with that particular hour of my life. The escalation, when it came, didn't come from me. It came from Talia, and it came fast. By the end of that week, she had changed the locks on the bedroom and begun packing my remaining belongings into boxes stacked along the garage wall, each one labeled in the same handwriting I'd seen at the bottom of the prenuptial agreement. She told mutual friends I had quietly accepted my position and would be gone within the month. There was nothing performed in the way she said it. That was what made it dangerous. She believed it completely, and a story told by someone who has stopped being able to tell it from the truth is far more durable than a lie. Gavin moved several of his own things into the house that same week. A colleague who lived 2 streets over mentioned to me, without knowing what he was really telling me, that he'd noticed an unfamiliar car in the driveway most mornings. Jordan came by the studio again on a Wednesday with a revised proposal, and near the end of the visit, almost as an afterthought, mentioned having seen Talia at a restaurant near the development district, sitting across from a man Jordan didn't recognize, with what looked like financial documents spread across the table between them. Columns of figures, multiple pages, the kind of spread that looks like someone building a case for a number. I thanked Jordan and didn't say much more about it in the moment, but that evening I called Lenora and told her what I'd heard. She was quiet for a beat, the way she got when a piece she'd been expecting finally landed where she thought it would. "That tracks with what the title monitoring service is showing," she said. "3 separate lender inquiries in the last 10 days. They're not waiting, Calvin. They're moving as fast as they can." The settlement proposal arrived by email the following Thursday, 4 pages long, written in the flat, efficient language of a document built to close a transaction rather than negotiate one. The terms were simple. I would relinquish all claims to the house and its contents in exchange for a payment Talia had described, in a note she'd written herself rather than letting her attorney write it, as generous given what I had actually contributed. The figure attached to that word wasn't generous. It was the number you offer someone when you're certain they have no better option, and you want the matter closed before they find one. I forwarded it to Lenora without comment. She called within the hour. "Don't respond yet," she said. "Let them wait. Every day they wait is a day they assume you're weighing it, and every day they assume that, they keep moving forward with the financing." "Is that what we want them doing?" I asked. "Moving forward?" "We need them fully committed," she said. "We need the loan applications finished and the declarations on record where nobody can call them preliminary. The moment to correct a mistake like this isn't while someone's still drawing the plans, Calvin. It's after they've already poured the foundation. That's when walking away costs more than admitting what they built was wrong. I understood the logic the way I understood a structural problem in a floor plan, the kind you don't fix by arguing with the client early. You let them commit to the materials first. I sent her a single message that night. "How long do you need?" She answered in under a minute. 2 weeks, maybe less if they move fast. I set the phone down on the studio desk and looked at the drawing in front of me, the one I hadn't touched in an hour. And I understood that the 2 weeks Lenora was asking for were going to be the longest and most carefully managed 2 weeks of my life. And that somewhere inside them, everything Talia believed about that house, about me, and about what she was entitled to, was going to come apart in a room she had chosen herself. The 2 weeks Lenora asked for started moving the moment I hung up, though nothing about the surface of my life changed. I kept working. I kept showing up to client meetings with drawings under my arm and nothing on my face that would have told anyone what was happening underneath it. Talia kept living in the house as though the question of who owned it had already been settled in her favor, and every day she believed that a little more completely was a day that worked in our favor instead of hers. Jordan came back to the studio on a Monday with a set of revised elevations, and near the end of the session, while we were both looking at a rendering of a staircase that still wasn't quite right, Jordan mentioned something that hadn't seemed important at the time it happened, months earlier. The firm that had won the office redesign contract, the one Jordan had lost, wasn't simply a firm Gavin preferred on the merits. Jordan had run into someone from that firm at an industry mixer the week before, and in the easy way people talk when they don't know what they're actually revealing, that person had mentioned owing Gavin a favor from years back, something about a permit issue Gavin had smoothed over for them. It hadn't been about the quality of the work at all. It had been about who Gavin trusted to keep his name out of a decision he didn't want questioned. I sat with that for a moment before I said anything. He wasn't protecting the project, I said. He was protecting himself. Jordan looked up from the rendering. "You think that's connected to all of this?" "I think," I said, "that a man who redirects one contract to keep someone quiet is a man who's done it before, and will do it again the moment it's useful to him." I didn't explain further, and Jordan didn't push. But I called Lenora that evening and told her what Jordan had said, not because I thought it changed anything legally, but because it changed how I understood the man standing beside my wife. Gavin wasn't simply careless with the truth. He was practiced at bending small mechanisms of power in his own direction, quietly enough that no one thought to look twice. "That's useful context," Lenora said. "Not evidence, context. Keep it in your pocket." 2 days later, she called with something that was closer to evidence. The title monitoring service she maintained on all trust properties had returned new activity, and this time it was specific enough to name. The first loan application had been filed through Ashford National, a bank Talia's company had used for years on other projects. The second and third had gone through a smaller lender called Cobalt Ridge Financial, one Talia had never used before, which told Lenora that whoever was managing the paperwork had gone shopping for a lender less likely to ask hard questions about an unfamiliar asset. "Both are moving," Lenora said. "Ashford is further along. Cobalt Ridge is close behind it. If I had to guess, I'd say Ashford closes first." "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "The Ashford application lists the property as collateral supporting a loan just over $600,000, she said. "Cobalt Ridge is smaller, but not by much. Combined, that's real money moving against an asset that was never theirs to pledge." I asked her what a permit contractor had said to a colleague of Jordan's the week before, a detail that had reached me sideways through the design world the way most useful information reaches a person who has spent 18 years building relationships in a small industry. A crew pulling a renovation permit at the house had run the property through the county system and gotten back a trust name instead of an individual owner. The contractor had flagged it to the property manager before proceeding, and the work order had been delayed 2 days while someone tried to sort out a discrepancy nobody at the house had bothered to explain to him. Lenora was quiet for a second when I told her, "That's the kind of thing that ends up mattering more than people expect," she said. Write down exactly what you heard, who said it, and when. I want it dated. I did. Talia called on a Saturday morning in the third week. I answered because Lenora had told me that anything Talia said on the phone could matter later, and ending a call quickly created confrontations that were harder to manage than conversations. Talia's voice had the measured register she used in professional settings, the one that made everything sound reasonable even when it wasn't. She said she'd sent a settlement proposal and hadn't received a response. She said she was trying to handle things fairly. She said her attorneys were confident in their position. "What review specifically have your attorneys done?" I asked her. "They pulled the property record," she said. "There's no individual deed in your name. That's not ambiguous, Calvin." "I understand," I said. "I'll be in touch through counsel." Before we hung up, she added one more sentence, almost offhand, the kind of thing a person says when they think a conversation is already over. "There are other things moving right now," she said. "I'd rather we settle this quickly for both our sakes." I sat with the phone in my hand after the call ended, turning that sentence over. Other things moving. It was the confirmation Lenora had been waiting for, proof that the financing was active enough that Talia wanted the property question closed before those applications finished. I sent Lenora 3 words. She called ready. Lenora's reply came back within the minute. Party invitation. I hadn't known what she meant until a colleague in the design industry mentioned 2 days later that she'd received an invitation to a gathering at the house, an evening framed as an introduction for a new venture Talia and a business partner were launching. A date was already attached, 12 days out. I told Lenora about it that same afternoon. "That's better than anything I could have planned," she said. "That's our room." I didn't yet know everything that would happen in that room, or how many people inside it would end up changing sides before the night was finished. What I knew was that Talia was about to stand in front of an audience she'd chosen herself and make her ownership of that house a matter of public record, and that everything Lenora and I had spent 3 weeks quietly assembling was going to have exactly the setting it needed. The first real confirmation that our patience was paying off came 4 days later, when Lenora called sounding, for the first time since this had started, almost pleased. She'd sent formal notice to Ashford National that morning, informing them in writing that the property listed as collateral on their pending loan belonged to the Ramsey Family Trust and carried no individual ownership that could support the declaration on file. Ashford's compliance department had responded within hours. The loan was frozen pending review. No further funds would move until the discrepancy was resolved. "That's it," I said. "That's real." "That's real," Lenora agreed. "One down. It's a good sign, Calvin, but it's one lender out of 2. Harrison Cole called that same evening to confirm a project meeting the following week, and somewhere in the middle of talking through scheduling, he mentioned, unprompted, that he was glad things seemed to be settling for me. I hadn't told him anything specific, only that I was going through a difficult stretch at home, and he hadn't asked for more than that. It was the kind of trust that had taken years to build, and hearing it in his voice that evening felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in 3 weeks. That was the evening I made the decision that would cost me more than I understood at the time. Cobalt Ridge Financial's application was still moving, and Lenora was ready to send the same notice she'd sent Ashford. But Harrison had a fund closing of his own in the coming days, a round he'd been building toward for months, one that mattered enormously to the studio's next chapter, and I didn't want a story about my marriage circulating through his investor calls before that closing was finished. I asked Lenora to hold the Cobalt Ridge notice for a few days, just until Harrison's round was settled. She didn't like it. I could hear that in the pause before she answered. "I'd rather move on both at once," she said. "Splitting the timing gives them room." "A few days," I said. "That's all I'm asking." "A few days," she repeated, in a tone that made it clear she was agreeing against her own judgment, not because she'd changed her mind. "I'll hold it, but I don't like leaving a door open, even a small one." I told her I understood, and I believed I did. What I didn't yet understand was that the door I'd asked her to leave open for my own comfort was exactly wide enough for Gavin to walk through. It happened faster than either of us expected. Gavin, whose position gave him more insight into lending timelines than either Lenora or I had accounted for, pushed Cobalt Ridge to accelerate the closing, citing an unspecified deadline on the venture's side. The bank, smaller and hungrier for the business than Ashford had been, moved the funds within 48 hours before Lenora's notice ever reached their compliance desk. By the time she called me with the news, the loan had already closed. The trust's property sat on paper as collateral behind a completed transaction, and Talia stood in front of her own circle telling anyone who asked that the new venture was fully funded. "It's done," Lenora said. "Cobalt Ridge dispersed yesterday. Notice arrived a day late." I didn't say anything for a moment. "This isn't fatal," she added, "but it complicates things considerably. Unwinding a closed loan is a different fight than freezing an open application. It takes longer, it takes more documentation, and it gives their side room to argue the property's already entangled in a legitimate transaction, whether or not that's true." That same week, Harrison called to reschedule our meeting, something he'd never done before in 3 years of working together. His voice had a different texture to it. Careful in a way I recognized because I'd spent 18 years learning to hear when a room had shifted. He didn't say much directly, only that he'd heard, secondhand, that my personal situation had gotten complicated, and that he wanted to give things a little space before we talked about the next commitment. I didn't ask who he'd heard it from. I already knew the shape of it well enough. Gavin had a way of planting a doubt without ever attaching his own name to it, and a man protecting a divorce and a family fortune at the same time was an easy story to tell an investor who hadn't decided yet whether to trust it. I sat in the studio that evening with both pieces of news in front of me, the frozen loan that had held and the one that hadn't, and I understood something I hadn't let myself understand until then. The plan Lenora and I had built, the one built entirely on patience, on letting Talia and Gavin commit themselves fully before we moved, had a hole in it, and the hole was mine. I had asked Lenora to wait, not because the strategy required it, but because I hadn't wanted my private failure spilling into the one relationship in my professional life that still felt uncomplicated. That instinct, the same one that had kept me quiet in that living room 3 weeks earlier instead of saying anything the moment I understood what I was looking at, had just cost us the one lever that would have stopped this cleanly. I called Lenora back that night. "I shouldn't have asked you to hold it," I said. "That's on me." "It's on both of us," she said, which was kind of her, and not entirely true. But dwelling on it doesn't get us anywhere. What matters now is what we do with what's left. "What's left," I said, "is a fraudulent declaration on a closed loan, a business partner starting to get nervous, and a wife standing in front of her whole professional circle in 9 days, telling everyone the house is hers and the venture is funded." "That's what's left," Lenora agreed. "So we stop waiting for the right moment to arrive on its own, and we start building it." I understood, sitting there, that the version of myself who had spent 3 weeks staying quiet, letting Lenora manage the timing, keeping my own name out of every uncomfortable conversation, wasn't going to be enough to finish this. Waiting had worked exactly once, and it had failed the moment real pressure was applied to it. If Cobalt Ridge had taught me anything, it was that Gavin would keep finding the door I left open, for as long as I kept leaving one. The next morning, I drove to Ashford National myself instead of letting Lenora's letter do the work alone, and sat across from a compliance officer with a notarized copy of the trust certification in my hand, because I wanted my own name attached to the correction, not just my attorney's letterhead. That afternoon, I called Harrison instead of waiting for him to call me, and told him the whole truth in 15 minutes. The divorce, the house, the loan, all of it, rather than let him keep hearing pieces of it from someone with a reason to shape the story. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment before he said he appreciated me telling him directly instead of letting him find out the way he'd been finding out. And that same afternoon, I called Lenora and told her I wasn't waiting for the dinner to happen to us anymore. I wanted to choose it. "I want to be in that room on my terms," I said, "not reacting to whatever she says. arriving with everything already decided. There was a pause on the line, and then something in Lenora's voice shifted, the sound of a person recalculating a plan she'd been running one way and was now willing to run another. "That's a different approach than the one we've been taking," she said. "It's the one that should have started 3 weeks ago," I said. Harrison called back 2 days later and told me, without my asking, that he intended to come to the dinner himself. It wasn't something I'd requested. It was something he offered, and we both understood what it meant for him to say it. A man deciding to walk into a room where my marriage was about to end publicly, in front of people who mattered to his own business, was a real risk on his part, not a small gesture, and I told him so. "You told me the truth when it would have been easier not to," he said. "I can afford to return the favor once." Harrison's offer didn't erase what I'd learned about my own instincts over the past 3 weeks, but it gave me something to build the final stretch on besides my own resolve, and I used the days that followed to make sure nothing about that room would be left to chance. Jordan came into the studio 2 days before the dinner, buzzing with something that had nothing to do with the drawings we were supposed to be reviewing. Word had moved through the design world the way it always did, sideways and fast. And what Jordan had heard was that Talia's new venture was already being talked about as fully capitalized, funded through a private arrangement nobody in the industry could quite name. 2 design firms Jordan knew had already reached out to Talia's people, asking to be considered for the launch collateral. I listened without correcting any of it. Every person repeating that story in the days before the dinner was a person who would be standing in that living room to hear it corrected in person, and I had stopped seeing any reason to get ahead of that. Lenora called that same afternoon with the final piece of the guest list, gathered the way she gathered most things now, through a network of people who owed her small favors from 30 years of careful practice. Among the names was a board member from Talia's company, a man named Preston Adair, who Lenora reminded me had sat on the committee that approved the office redesign contract the year Jordan lost it to Gavin's preferred firm. He wasn't attending as anyone's guest of honor. He was attending because Talia had personally invited him, hoping his presence would lend her new venture the credibility of institutional backing before she'd earned any. "He has no idea what he's about to watch," Lenora said. "But he's exactly the kind of witness that turns a private humiliation into a professional consequence. Whatever happens in that room, he'll remember it in a context that matters to her far more than we do." I asked whether that meant we could count on him doing anything. "No," she said. "It means we can count on him seeing clearly. What he does with what he sees is his business, not ours. That's the difference between using a witness and manufacturing one." The following morning, a call came through that told me Gavin hadn't spent the intervening days sitting still either. A contact of Lenora's inside Cobalt Ridge Financial, someone who owed her nothing but professional courtesy, mentioned that a company representative named Renata Cho, the commercial lending officer who'd overseen the closing, had received a call from Gavin the week before. He hadn't threatened her. He was too careful for that. He'd framed the property dispute as a private family matter, already resolving itself through the divorce, and suggested that if Cobalt Ridge moved to reverse a loan it had already funded in good faith, the bank would be the party left exposed, not his side of the argument. He'd planted, gently and deniably, the idea that defending the transaction as legitimate was in the bank's own interest. "That's smart," I said, and I meant it as a warning to myself as much as anything. "It's smart, and it's a problem," Lenora said. "If Renata Cho walks into that room already leaning toward protecting her own bank's position, she's not going to reverse a closed loan just because we hand her a document. She'll need a reason strong enough to outweigh the one Gavin's already given her." I asked her what that meant for the evidence we had. "It means the evidence gets us in the door," she said. "It doesn't guarantee what happens once we're standing in front of her. Even with everything we have, whether that loan actually unwinds depends on a decision she makes standing in that living room, in front of people, with her own institution's exposure on her mind. We can't script that part, Calvin. Nobody can." It was the first time since the false defeat that I understood the shape of what was still uncertain. We had the trust certification, the prenuptial agreement, Sandra's report, and the record of a fraudulent declaration on a closed loan, and none of it by itself forced Renata Cho to do anything. She could listen to every document Lenora laid on that table and still choose, in the moment, to protect her bank's position rather than admit her institution had funded a transaction built on a lie. The victory Lenora and I had spent 3 weeks assembling still had a door in it we couldn't close from the outside. "Then we don't lead with the loan," I said. "We let Talia make the claim publicly first. Every other document falls into place around that claim. By the time we get to the loan, the room won't be asking whether Renata Cho believes us. They'll already know." Lenora was quiet for a moment, the way she got when she was testing an idea against 30 years of watching plans survive or fail in rooms like the one we were about to walk into. "That's the right order," she said finally. "Ownership, then the marriage, then the money. Let the shape of the lie build itself before we show anyone the ledger." We didn't tell anyone else the sequence. Not Harrison, not Jordan, not even Preston Adair, whose presence we were counting on without his knowing it. Talia was going to stand in front of her own chosen audience and make her claim in her own words, and everything Lenora and I had built was going to have exactly the shape it needed by the time she finished. The evening of the dinner, I stood outside the house I had once designed room by room, watching amber light move across the front windows the way it had every evening for 15 years. And I understood that whatever happened next, I was walking in as someone who had finally stopped waiting for the right moment to arrive on its own. I rang the bell instead of using my key, and Talia opened the door herself. She looked at the valise in my hand, then at my face, and whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some expectation she'd already settled on, because she stepped back and let me in without warmth and without resistance, the way you let in something you believe you've already accounted for. The living room held close to 20 people, colleagues from Talia's company, a pair of unfamiliar faces I recognized from Lenora's description as development contacts. Renata Cho stood near the kitchen entrance, a glass of water in one hand, watching the room with the careful attention of someone deciding how much of herself to commit to an evening before she understood what it was for. Harrison stood near the built-in shelving I had installed years earlier, and near the far wall, in conversation with 2 of the development contacts, stood a man I hadn't met but recognized instantly from Lenora's description. Preston Adair. Gavin moved through the gathering with his hand at the small of Talia's back whenever she stood close enough, the posture of a man who had decided the matter was already settled. When his eyes found the valise, something in his shoulders eased, the particular relief of a person watching an outcome arrive exactly as expected. Talia moved to the center of the room a few minutes later, and the gathering quieted the way rooms quiet for people who've decided to be heard. She spoke about the venture, about the partnership she and Gavin were building, about the trajectory that had brought her to this point. And then, with the same casual ownership she'd used the night I found them together, she gestured toward the room around her. "My home," she said. "This space I've built." She looked at me directly then, said she was glad I'd come to collect the rest of my things, said she hoped the transition would be smooth for both of us, in the register of someone being generous to a person who no longer had standing to argue otherwise. Gavin stepped forward and handed me a document, a formal notice barring me from the property without Talia's consent. He said something about my studio being better suited to a different location. I took the paper. I read it without expression. Then I looked at Talia and asked her the same question I'd asked her 3 weeks earlier, standing in this same room, before either of us understood how far it would travel. "Are you sure about the paperwork on this property?" Her jaw tightened. She said her attorneys had reviewed everything, that there was nothing in my name, and that if I had concerns, I was welcome to raise them through counsel. "Good," I said, "because mine just arrived." The front door opened at 7:30 precisely. Lenora crossed the entry in the same unhurried stride she'd used to walk into contested rooms for 30 years, set her case on the dining table, and opened it without asking anyone's permission. "I'll need you to sign an acknowledgement that you've received these materials," she told Talia. "For now, I'd like to walk through what's here." Talia's attorney stepped forward from near the kitchen and said his client hadn't consented to this proceeding in this setting. Your client publicly asserted ownership of this property approximately 3 minutes ago in front of 20 witnesses, Lenora said without raising her voice. This setting is the appropriate response to that assertion. She laid the first document on the table. The trust certification, establishing the property's ownership, its date of acquisition, and a complete payment history drawn entirely from trust accounts with no contribution from any marital fund. She read the key provisions aloud, slowly enough for the room to follow. The second document was the prenuptial agreement, turned to the page carrying Talia's signature beneath the residence clause. Lenora noted, evenly, that Talia had been offered independent counsel before signing and had declined in writing. The room had gone quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when people have stopped expecting anything and started simply absorbing what's in front of them. Talia's expression hadn't broken, but the quality of her stillness had changed, composed, sliding into controlled, and anyone who'd spent years reading rooms could see the difference. The third document was Sandra Vance's report. Lenora summarized 11 months of documented contact between Talia and Gavin, sufficient to satisfy the infidelity clause that ended Talia's residential rights the moment the marriage was broken from within it. Gavin's face lost its smoothness in stages, the way a presentation degrades when the material underneath turns out not to be what he'd been told. The fourth document was the one that reached Renata Cho directly. Lenora laid it on the table and looked at her. This is the loan Cobalt Ridge closed 9 days ago, listing this property as collateral, supported by a declaration signed by Ms. Ramsey certifying it as marital. It is not. It has never been. Renata set her glass down. For a moment she didn't move, and I understood that this was the moment Lenora had told me we couldn't script. Then Gavin spoke quickly before Renata could. That loan closed in good faith, he said. Cobalt Ridge has no obligation to unwind a completed transaction over a family dispute. If anything, reversing it now exposes the bank to more liability than leaving it alone. Renata looked at him, then at the document, then, finally, at me. Was the collateral declaration accurate at the time it was signed? She asked, not to Gavin, but to Lenora. No, Lenora said. It never has been. Then the collateral was never valid, Renata said, regardless of what closed on top of it. My institution isn't in the business of defending a declaration we now know was false, Mr. Mercer, whatever it costs to correct. She said it plainly, the words of someone choosing her own institution's integrity over the version of the story Gavin had spent a week building for her. Gavin didn't answer. He looked at Talia, and Talia didn't look back at him. Talia's attorney tried once more, arguing the trust documentation could be challenged. Lenora told him it had existed since before I was born, that it was a matter of public record, and that he was welcome to contest it in any forum he preferred. Across the room, Preston Adair set down his drink, took out his phone, typed something briefly, and put it away without a word to anyone. Lenora turned back to Talia and asked the question she had built the entire evening toward. If this property belongs to you, she said, which document carries your name on the ownership record? Talia didn't answer. What followed wasn't a scene. Renata excused herself quietly, gathering her things with the efficiency of someone who'd already decided the meeting had concluded. The development contacts offered brief, non-committal words on their way to the door. Harrison crossed the room, stopped beside me, and said, low enough that only I could hear it, "Send me the proposal this week if you're ready." Then he left, and within 20 minutes the room held only Talia, Gavin, Lenora, Talia's attorney, and me. Gavin picked up his jacket from the back of a dining chair. He said to no one in particular that he'd been under the impression the property situation had been fully verified before any applications were filed. He said Talia had confirmed it. He said he'd need to speak with his own counsel, and he left without looking back, without the assurance he'd carried into the room 3 hours earlier. Talia's attorney conferred with her briefly near the kitchen, and they left together. I stood near the studio doorway. The built-in shelving was still there. The proportions of the room were still correct. and in a few hours the light would move across the east-facing window exactly the way I had planned it, years before any of this had a reason to matter. The divorce moved without meaningful contest once Talia's attorneys had reviewed everything Lenora had assembled. The prenuptial agreement left no room to argue. Cobalt Ridge formally voided the loan the following week, and Ashford National closed its own file once the underlying claim collapsed. Talia kept her personal accounts, her earnings, the investments she'd built independently, and I didn't ask for any of it. She lost the right of residence, and the settlement gave her 30 days to collect her belongings, the legally appropriate window, which I didn't contest or shorten. Preston Adair opened a formal review through his company's channels within days of the dinner, one that had nothing to do with our divorce and everything to do with what he'd witnessed a board member's own colleague claim in front of 2 commercial lenders about an asset that had never belonged to her. Talia's executive position ended a month later as a result of findings entirely separate from anything Lenora or I had filed. Jordan's original design proposal, the one Gavin had quietly redirected the year before, went back out for rebid once the internal review reached that contract. Jordan called to ask what I thought they should do. "Submit it," I said. "The work was good the first time. Nothing about the work has changed." Jordan submitted it and won it, and 6 months later I handed Jordan a key to the east wing of the house, a working studio with proper light and enough room to spread drawings across more than one surface at once. The first morning Jordan worked there, I was already at my own table when they arrived, and we worked for several hours without saying much, which was the right way to do it. Harrison came by that spring to look over a proposal I'd sent him in January and asked, almost in passing, what the East Wing was for now. I told him. He looked at it for a moment, said it was a good use of the space, and we went back to the drawings because there was work to do. A year after the dinner, my phone rang on a Tuesday evening. Talia. I answered because I decided somewhere along the way that I wasn't going to become someone who managed grief by refusing contact. She asked if I ever thought about the marriage, not how it ended, but what it had been. "I think about the work I did in it," I told her. "I think about the choices I made that were real. I don't think about the version of it you decided to tell." She said she understood. "I don't need you to," I said, and I meant it without any weight behind the words at all, which was its own kind of answer. I set the phone down and looked at the floor plan spread across my table, a house I'd been commissioned to design from the ground up, the first project like it I'd taken in years. The proportions were good. The light was going to work exactly the way it needed to. I'd spent 3 weeks on the east-facing wall alone, making sure it would do precisely what I wanted it to do. I picked up my pencil, found the line that still needed adjusting, and drew it.